This is the final video for chapter 3 about internal alignment or internal equity. So we have some strategic choices we have to make when we're designing our internal structures, our internal pay structures. We have to think about how specifically we tailor our organization design. So for example, what kind of hierarchy are you going to have? Are you going to have a flat organization? Are you going to have a lot of different levels? And then how the workflow to make that structure. So how are people going to make the goods and services that they need to meet this organizational strategy that you have for your organization? You also have to think about how you're going to distribute pay throughout the levels in your structure. If you're going to have a lot of different levels, do you want to have a lot of pay differentials across those levels, which may be appropriate for a very large institution like a university? Or do you want to have smaller pay differentials to motivate employees to move up levels, especially if you don't have that very many employees or you aren't a very large organization? So let's talk about the different kinds of ways that we can structure our organization that affects the wage structures that we have in the organization as well. So one is called tailored versus loosely coupled. This is the way that jobs are structured that affects our pay structures as well. So in a tailored organization, your jobs are very well defined. They have detailed tasks or steps to follow. You may have standard operating procedures, for example. And that's because the jobs have very specific tasks in them that have to be done in order to do those jobs, but also for those jobs to then contribute to the organizational strategy. Because those job tasks are well defined, you have pay structures that are also well defined too. So you can say, well, your job includes these specific tasks, and we know exactly how those tasks are done and what skills and competencies are needed for those tasks. So here's the pay that we give for the specific job. Some really good examples, and the book describes this really well, are McDonald's or Walmart. I remember I worked in fast food. That was my first job ever. Each job, you had a very specific way that you did that job. So if you were going to cook the food, you had very specific ways of cooking each item of food, of doing the orders. What order do you do the tickets in, that sort of thing. I worked on drive-through. You had a very specific way of taking the orders. We had to count the change. We had to make the drinks. We had to check the orders. That was all very well detailed and very well described in the job descriptions, the tasks in those jobs, and the way we were trained. A lot of you will eventually, if you don't now, work in loosely coupled organizations. So here, and the reason I'm saying this is a lot of you are going to be knowledge workers where you do things that have either never been done before, or the kinds of tasks that you do change from client to client or from project to project. These are often in, these loosely coupled structures are in competitive environments that are often turbulent and unpredictable, where things are constantly changing. There may not be one way of doing things, or the way that doing things worked in the past is not going to work in the future. There aren't necessarily steps laid out on how to do the tasks, especially because they're very new tasks. They're very complex tasks. You would waste a lot of time trying to come up with the steps without just doing the work. You may work on teams, and you may work on several teams where you're designing lots of different product services or projects all at the same time. And that's because you're using your skills and competencies on each of those teams in different ways. Your pay structure then is going to be very loosely linked to the organization because it wants to provide that flexibility for people to bring in different skills and competencies and to use those in different ways for the different projects or the different products and services they're going to be working on. Because everything's not exactly laid out what those tasks are all the time, the pay structure can't pay the way that a tailored structure can, where it's really well defined, because your tasks could be different based on each project, and each employee just has different tasks that are part of their job, even if they have the same job title. So really good example in the book is 3M. I think a lot of you will work in these kinds of jobs where you're just doing something different kind of every day at work. But that's also why your pay structure can't be as well defined as it could be under a tailored system. We also have hierarchical versus egalitarian structures. I've already mentioned these before. In a hierarchical structure, you have many different pay levels. Your differentials can be very large, especially the larger that organization is, like a university. So how much a university president gets paid versus a tenured professor versus an instructor versus someone who works as administrative assistants in the office is going to be quite different. But that's because also what they need to do as part of those jobs is very different. In a hierarchical organization, you're going to have individual performers who are going to be motivated and going to be incentivized individually, meaning that you're looking at how people are performing their jobs from year to year or whatever the time period is going to be, and you're going to give them pay bonuses or promotions based on how well they're doing their job. In an egalitarian structure, you have very few levels. Your differentials may be much smaller, especially for smaller organizations where there just aren't a lot of people in that organization. And people are going to be working in teams more because your projects may be more complex. Again, you have fewer levels. So the difference is you're not going to have like a college president working with an administrative assistant. You're going to have, like, for example, lots of engineers. Some may be at different levels of engineering, but they can all work together on the same project, building a bridge or a building or something like that. What you're really going for then is, because people are working in teams, you want equal treatment in the teams, or equity within those teams, so that people feel like they can contribute to those teams and they're getting paid fairly. And that also means that you are trying to promote cooperation in those teams instead of having people compete against each other for promotions. We also have layered versus delayered structures, yet another thing that's already been mentioned in these videos. So you can have a layered structure where you have lots of different levels or different layers of job titles, and there's some difference between these, but they're not maybe very big differences. So on the left, we have a layered structure that has 8 different jobs. And the difference between, say, an engineer trainee at the very bottom and an engineer might be just 1 year of experience, for example. What you can do is you can delayer these jobs, kind of combine job titles into one layer, so that you have fewer layers. That can make your organization more efficient, but it does mean that you might have some bigger differentials between the layers because they're combining different jobs. So an associate engineer would have been what was called an engineer trainee, an engineer, and a senior engineer in the past. And those would be all in the associate engineer. What makes this easier in your pay structure is that people don't have to get promoted to keep getting pay increases, because it may just be over time they're increasing their skills and competencies within the same layer in that organization. But it does mean the difference between an associate and a consulting engineer is going to be much larger, because in the past, those were actually from engineer trainee up to lead engineer is 4 different layers that you've combined into just 2 different job titles here. And that might mean that it's not just years of experience in the organization. You may need different certifications, different education, maybe different kinds of experiences on different kinds of projects to get from associate engineer to consulting engineer. So let me talk about 3 main theories in this chapter. We've already mentioned some of these, but we haven't put the name to them yet. So equity theory is the perception of fairness about your pay structure that employees have. We just talked about that in the last video, and we talked specifically about procedural and distributive justice. Procedural justice was about the way decisions are made around pay and how transparent those pay systems are, and distributive justice was the actual pay that people get. Fairness is determined by employees through a lot of different comparisons. So these perceptions can constantly change for employees. What was fair today may not be considered fair in a month. So employees are constantly comparing their pay to people in similar jobs in the organization, in different jobs in the same organization they work in, and even in their jobs in other organizations to see if it's fair. So if they see a lot of differences between other people's pay and their pay, especially if their pay is much lower than other people's pay, they'll perceive their pay system or pay structure is unfair, even if they understand how the pay is determined. But I want to be careful. Equity is not the same as equality. We don't need to pay everyone exactly the same for people to perceive that pay structure as fair. So for example, you can have 2 employees that do exactly the same job, but one may be paid more than the other because they have more skills and competencies that they're bringing to the job. Maybe they have several more years of experience. Maybe they have a certification or a master's degree. What makes that employee potentially of more use value for the organization is, even if they don't use those skills and competencies they're bringing in the job that they have now, they could use them in the future. And so they're more adaptable at changes within that structure of that organization. But also because of that, they get paid more within that pay structure. That's equity, even though they're not being paid equally, but most employees probably perceive that as fair. The second theory is called tournament theory. And this idea is that all players here, and players are employees, will work better when the differentials between pay of different levels of the organization are much larger. So this is the idea that people who see that, like, say their supervisors are getting paid much more than they are going to be motivated to try to become a supervisor in the future, because they can see how much more pay they'll get if they become a supervisor. that also means that you're trying to motivate employees to do the things they need to do to get to that level. So maybe to be a supervisor, they need to get some management training. Maybe they need to take responsibility for a project or a team. Maybe they need to go get an MBA. There could be lots of different things that you're trying to motivate people to do to get to that next level. Generally, then, if tournament theory is the way that you're running your organization or what you believe motivates employees, what you're going to do is you're going to incentivize individuals to perform better because they're the ones who have to do the things to get to that next level, not whole teams. So that's where someone getting an MBA or someone getting some management training is important because the team doesn't do that together usually. It's usually an individual that does that. Our third theory is called institutional theory. This is not about employees, whether it's their perceptions of fairness around a pay system, which is equity theory, or what motivates them to want to move up in the organization, which is tournament theory. This is actually about the organization itself. So institutional theory says that there's a lot of what they call normative pressures or the pressure to conform within an environment for an organization. By conforming, what you can do is you get to see what other organizations are doing in terms of their organizational strategy and also their pay structures. And you can replicate that in your own organization with the belief that if it's working for this organization in the same industry, it should work at least in my organization as well. So the idea is that you see someone else doing something, you don't have to take the risk to understand how that works. You can already see it works and you'll just apply it yourself. This means that very few firms want to be what we call first movers. They're not the ones who want to take the risk of trying something completely new to see if they can attract new employees or motivate their employees in a different way. Because if it doesn't work out, you could actually lose your organization. You could go bankrupt if you take the first move and it doesn't go well. You could get very huge gains as well. But for a lot of organizations, the threat of not existing anymore is much bigger than making, a lot more money that you can distribute to your employees and to top management. So instead, what most companies do is they just copy innovative practices that they see other organizations do and see them working quite well. And then they take less risk, but they at least have a structure then that they think will work. The drawback to this, though, and you can probably already see this, is if two different organizations have very different strategies, then copying someone else's pay structure may not work in the strategy that you have. A really good example is if you have a pay structure where, say you're working at Walmart and your strategy is to have the lowest cost items that you can provide with some versatility or variety for employees, or not employees, I mean customers, then you may not pay your employees as much as you would if you were focused on something else in your strategy, because part of getting the low cost in those products is to make as productive and efficient your employees as you can, and also keeping those prices down or those costs down for those employees, since that's your biggest cost usually as an employer. If your strategy may be to have higher quality products and less variability in those products so that you can really focus on getting higher quality. That may mean that you need to pay your employees more because what you're doing is you're trying to create better, not only better quality products, but a better customer service experience as well for your customers. This does mean, though, that you're not getting the efficiency of low cost now for your employees. However, what you are asking them to do is be better at some things that aren't just about cost. So customer service, for example. And so that can be the drawback of institutional theory. If you're applying the pay structure of one organization on another, it just may not fit with the strategy for the different organizations.